Welcome, everyone, to our November 1st CS Bars meeting. To begin, can we have our roll call, please?
Yes. Jason Amesqua,
Here.
Dr. James Bolton,
Here.
Jay Frickberg,
Present.
William Hunt,
Present.
Paul Kramer,
Present.
Kevin Marshall,
Present.
Philomena Euroshek.
Present.
All right, we have a quorum.
Yep. We'll move on to our public comment. Again, members of the public can make written public comment submitted to the csbars@calbar.cal.gov email box. Written public comments were not received, but if they were, they'd be distributed to our CSBRs members. Sorry, we did receive two. Sorry, my apology. Verbal public comments of up to 3 minutes will be taken now. First, recognize any individuals who signed up in advance using the link on the agenda. No one signed up in advance. Or by raising their hands virtually through the raise hand function on Zoom, or by pressing *9 on a phone. Do we have anyone who'd like to make public comment?
Dean Frickberg, I don't see any hands raised at this time. I do want to make a clarification that the email box is csbars@calbar.ca.gov, but we will always place that email on an agenda, or if the agenda is not up yet, you can always look at a past agenda to see that address, and we welcome written as well as verbal public comment. Thank you.
So with no public comment, we do think the public comment that was received in the written form prior for our review. There is no chair's report. I do believe we have a director's report. I'll turn over to that.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to take a moment to draw attention to an issue that was identified and a solution that we're communicating to our law school stakeholders. So we have found that our July 2024 bar exam results will be released on November 12th, and our law school annual compliance reports are to be delivered to the state bar's offices by November 15th. And there is one document in that entire package that requires a July 2024 bar exam statistic to be submitted. So there is a solution that we are going to enact, and that is that if a law school feels that they need to mail their annual report materials prior to the November 12th exam results released to law schools, they can do so without that one document, which is our disclosure form required by California Business and Professions Code 6061.7. They can submit all of their annual report documents except that one document, and then they can input the statistic that's going to be released on November 12th, so long as they email that disclosure document to lawschoolregulation@calbar.ca.gov by the November 15th deadline. We'll still consider all of the materials timely submitted. So I think there are some law schools that may choose to wait till after they have that statistic in hand to mail all their materials, knowing that will arrive by the November 15th deadline. But others may want to have all of their annual report materials in the mail prior to that date. Again, all other materials should be submitted. Just that one document, the disclosure form, can be withheld and emailed to staff separately. So an email communication will go out to all of our law school partners or our stakeholders, those who are not in attendance today, and we'll make that instruction and that solution clear.
Thank
And that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Our next agendized item is just our review of our minutes from our meeting on October 8th. Those are distributed prior to our committee members and posted. Is there a motion to adopt or a discussion to correct the proposed minutes?
I move to adopt.
Is there a second?
Second.
Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Jason Amesqua,
Yes.
Dr. James Bolton,
Yes.
William Hunt,
Yes.
Paul Kramer,
Yes.
Kevin Marshall,
Yes.
Philomena Yaroshek,
Yes.
and Chair Frickberg.
Yes.
All right, with 7 yeses, the motion has passed.
Thank you. And that brings us now to agenda item 7.1, which is the purpose of our extra meeting that we're having today. Ms. Leonard, would you like to bring up the deck of cards so we can take a look at those? And are we going to go through each one again? I know that we went through item 1 and 2 in our last meeting. Should we touch on those as well again this time? Oh, you're muted.
To the extent that you'd like to provide any sort of summary for the purposes of the public, this meeting plus the prior that happened earlier in October were held for the purpose of securing feedback from not only CS bars but also the public about proposed changes and updates to the unaccredited rules revision. So the early October suggestions are summarized in today's minutes, and to the extent that you'd like to highlight any or all in particular, Dean Frickberg, I would defer to you. And then today we'll continue the discussion with those that have not yet shared their feedback.
Okay. Well, I don't think we need to go through a second iteration of them since they are posted. I would just ask for our first item 1. That was Dean Marshall. Dean Marshall, is there anything you'd like us to touch again or reference again from your presentation?
No, but thank you for asking. I think we can proceed.
Thank you. And then item number 2, those are Deans Hunt and Yaroshek. Would you like to discuss any matters from your presentation prior?
I only have one, and because we did a great job collectively last time with 4.241. The only one that I would talk about is Rule 4.260. And in my written comments, I made a non-substantive edits to tighten and reorganize it, and those are part of the minutes. So I have no further comments on that.
I think with this, we're ready to turn to Dean Amezcua, and I'd like to express gratitude to Dean Amezcua that in spite of the many things that were discussed last time and the extra time that we needed to invest to talk about some of the bar preparation programs, he was able to pose a few questions for the group to think about to enrich today's discussion, which was very appreciated. So Dean Amezcua, I'll turn it over to you to talk about the proposed updates to the descriptions of the various categories for unaccredited law schools.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. The area of review that I was given is 4.204I and 4.240B. I'll start with the 4.240B first. The new statutes that identify or the Business Professionals Code identifies correspondence and fixed facility identifies correspondence and fixed facility. The new rule would propose to change it to synchronous versus asynchronous learning to more modernize how the legal education is offered by registered schools. I think the new proposal does allow to designate this through primarily being interactive or primarily being on demand, and to clarify credit hours between the 270 hours for asynchronous and 384 hours of study for asynchronous and the 270 for synchronous. I would just reiterate, my comment from before that because, there's different styles of how asynchronous and synchronous learning is presented or used by the different registered schools, that I would highly encourage that the other registered schools continue to provide their insights and comments as we go through this process in the months to come. One of the things I wanted to point out for discussion was that in the previous guidelines for unaccredited registered schools, as a part of correspondence or distance learning, there was an explanation of there needing to be 48 to 52 weeks of continuous study for each year within the 4-year program. So per year, 48 to 52 weeks, or I think 24 to 26 weeks for half a year. And so it does not appear that these were included in the revisions. So I would support, or I would, I'm in favor, and I believe that not having the 48 to 52 week, explanation does help the flexibility of the registered schools, provide their learning in the way that they see most effective for the students that they serve, and not have to, and if they choose, not have to spread their course structure out to almost a full year versus a more traditional schedule, and to include appropriate breaks in study for students and things like that. But because it's done differently in the asynchronous space and even in the synchronous space, I do think that this provides more flexibility, but also more clarity for how the learning happens and the rules that are associated with it in terms of hours requirements and other things are appropriate. I think that would probably be my main comment about 4.240B, going back to 2.204I. My only comment on that, which I have discussed with other unaccredited deans and had been previously mentioned in a previous public comment, is the idea of the unaccredited language, the use of the word unaccredited to describe registered schools. I understand that that's been the use and a distinction for consumer protection between accredited and registered schools. I do believe that these rules as they're being revised, having some inclusion of accredited standards that are similar to accredited schools, as well as the additional requirements that continue to be included and those that are added for consumer protection of students that attend these schools, do show that these schools do not fit the more common definition of an unaccredited school in any kind of educational landscape. And so I do believe that in the current era that we are with, students being very mindful of weighing the factors in going to registered or choosing their law school that's going to fit them the best, and coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, low socioeconomic backgrounds, that the unaccredited wording may create more barriers to their consideration of law school in general, to stay with these terms. I also think that we do have fairly rigorous requirements for disclosures of things and that are being described and are being further added to these rules that do include fair notice of the conditions or the type of schools that they are looking to attend and when they're noticed of those disclosures. So it would be something that I would just put up for conversation or comment about. Should we at least give the committee an opportunity to discuss, or and we give some feedback about continuing to use unaccredited versus registered, and then maybe finding other ways to describe for consumer protection and for the protections that the State Bar mission upholds to make sure that they are that those standards are still being met without using language that could unnecessarily bias students that in their consideration of these different schools. I believe those are all the comments that I have about these two sections.
Any discussion from our committee? Ms. Leonard?
Yeah. Here's a question from staff regarding these areas. So right now, under the current rules, as Dina Mesqua stated, there are three categories. There's a distance category, a correspondence category, and a fixed facility category. These definitions were created many years ago. And over the course of the expansion of legal education and the change in legal education since COVID, we've seen a lot of change. And so the hope is to create definitions that will allow schools to create the kinds of programs that schools want and need, but that will also clearly describe those programs to consumers. So we're particularly concerned to know if this proposed definition appears clear to the public and something that will work for your schools, either now or what you plan to do in the near future.
Dean Hunt?
Thank you. I think it's fantastic, really. I think it's a far better description of what's happening in education today. The asynchronous obviously covers correspondence, self-paced type programs that may be doing it the old-fashioned way, where you are literally mailed materials in the mail for you to review, or delivering an online platform that you log into. But it still would be an asynchronous type program. And the synchronous really does cover online law schools that are using live video conferencing, as well as residential law schools where students attend. And so I think it is an excellent way of structuring it, and clear and concise for the consumer as well. So I think it's a great idea. I also thought that Mr. Amesca's argument regarding the use of the word unaccredited rather than registered, I would concur with that as well. I think the use of the unaccredited terminology probably is more misleading than helpful for the students as well as the public. So I concur with both points that were presented.
Hunt, thank you for that feedback. And just for everyone outside, because we're talking about a lot of detailed information, you may hear me clacking away, taking notes. I apologize in advance, but it's only in service of the commission.
Any additional discussion from our committee members?
Question for Natalie. Are we taking away the 48 to 52 week requirement? Is that the current proposal? I forgot.
Well, right now it is not in there, which would emphasize that there is a little bit more flexibility for breaks for those schools that may wish to use that versus those that like to have an every week check-in. So, but again, everything is in the proposal stage, so everything is up for discussion. The statute itself does require study in year chunks. And State Bar intention is still to recognize half year and year. So there is some structure in how a year must still be structured, composed. so that, for example, all of the learning doesn't take place in the last week of the year. And it's also structured so that students that earn a half-year credit can do so.
Okay, so yeah, because I think one concern is that we don't want to have people so accelerate their law school experience that they sort of miss out on the time, to us to really take in the materials and what I call socialize in the law, which in other words, it's not a race; it's a more deliberate process to become educated. And so we would just do that by saying maybe you can do a year a little bit quicker, but it's still going to take you 4 years out overall.
Mhm.
Okay.
Right. And part of the element of sound education in the inspections will be working with the school to learn the types of check-ins that they do, the types of cues to determine when support is needed for students and things like that. And so that really does require that the education take place over time period.
Yeah, on the jettisoning the term unaccredited, I am concerned that does provide a great opportunity for confusion. Um, does anyone? Well, no, I'm not going to ask that. That's um, too loaded. But it's going to require, if you have a phrase like registered, it requires the students to basically look up what the differences are. And because in my experience, at least, disclosures don't necessarily have the uptake that we would like them to have. And having both unaccredited and accredited schools, as terms is somewhat clear that there's a distinction. More clear than registered and unaccredited, I think.
Dean
We'll
Hunt?
see. We'll leave it for.
As to Mr. Kramer's point regarding the 48 to 52 week rule, I think the 864 hours for the asynchronous is going to guarantee a certain amount of time that certainly will have to be invested. You can't really get 864 hours in a couple of weeks at the end of the year. And the 270 hours of class time also ensures that there is going to be a certain amount of time, but it would allow students in our program currently, the summer session is required. There's no way around it. So our students are taking 3 semesters a year, 2 courses per semester. It would be nice to say, well, if you want to do 3 courses each semester, you could have your summers off. And people with kids would like to have, when their kids are on vacation from school, the opportunity to be home with them. So I see real advantages to it. And yet I don't think it at all jeopardizes their legal education, nor accelerates it beyond anything that's reasonable. And of course, the state bar's inspections would ferret out anything that is unreasonable, I think. As far as the unaccredited versus registered, I know there are differences between the 2 programs. The primary difference, in my observation, is the first year law students exam. And that's the difference between the 2. And so to call one accredited and the other unaccredited solely based on the first year law students exam, that's something that the students attending the registered unaccredited law schools already know about. It's part of our disclosure and discussion when recruiting and after they've signed up and so on and so on.
Dean Marshall?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to drop in on that latter part of the conversation about the distinction between registered and unaccredited. And I kind of I lean towards Mr. Kramer's concern, and that is both the term registered and the term accredited have a much deep definition that has to be explained to the consuming public. And so, because there is a big difference in the standards that apply. In fact, that's what we're discussing today. I know that I have engaged in the exercise several times trying to explain to the layperson the categories of eligibility to sit for the bar exam across those 4 categories, I think, that are available. So I would just caution us to be very careful from a consumer protection division that we don't create more ambiguity by brevity. And we take that this regulation seriously.
Dean Mesqua.
So I appreciate Dean Marshall's comments, and as well as Mr. Kramer as well. I agree. I think that if we do move in the direction of not using unaccredited, then that, it might open a bigger window of, is the relationship between the state bar and Cal schools unaccredited, and is that an actual accreditation type of thing? I think we do use that language because I think the accredited word most fits very well, but we are describing tiers of types of schools that are both well regulated, and include a decent amount of consumer protections. And just to add to Dean Hunt's comment, is that there are requirements within the rules to place the explanations in various places on websites, in descriptions for and marketing materials, and associations to all of those things. So I do think those can be discussed in terms of what is an appropriate level of disclosure, and if there's other pieces that should be regularly noticed to students. It is. I think I do agree it's a tough conversation. I do, though. One of the things I didn't mention is that we have at least two current registered unaccredited schools that have regional or national accreditation through an actual higher education accreditor, and that presents some difficulty in explaining the nuances again that we're talking about, and so we also want to make it fair for those that have that type of accreditation, that have gone through that work and done that and are regularly maintaining that accreditation, and that are also, and then for those schools that would aspire to attain a certain level of accreditation as well, or associate with a school that is with another institution that is accredited, but have a program of the law school that is unaccredited. I just think that if we could have a better discussion about that, to really modernize that language, would be worth the effort.
And Dean Yaroshek.
Just pulling back and thinking about what's the purpose of the terminology, right? It's the consumer protection so that applicants will know the status in relations to the state bar. And so I think that just registered by itself or just unaccredited by itself doesn't compare the different tiers. So I think that the proposed definition of combining, because when I talk to individuals, what does registered as compared to accredited? And so having to go through all of that explanation. And I think if you've got it clearly, they're registered, but as compared to the other tiers, ABA and accredited, they're not ABA and they're not accredited. And so just pulling back as, somebody who doesn't know, looking at from a perspective of our applicants, how can we best describe the tiers? And so I think that the proposed having both terms together, registered, unaccredited, provides a good comparison.
And Dean Hunt?
I was just going to chime in. I guess my issue with the unaccredited, the unaccredited law schools used to be under the BPPVE, the Bureau for Private Post-Secondary Vocational Education, run through the state of California. And that organization was sunset for a couple of years under Governor Schwarzenegger. And the state bar took over inspections and review of the unaccredited. It used to be there was virtually no relationship between the state bar and the unaccredited. And that is not the case at all anymore for the last 15, 16 years since we were moved under the state bar. We pay our annual dues to the state bar. We're inspected by the state bar. That's not no relationship as it had been previously. And so I guess I don't think the unaccredited reflects our current relationship with the state bar.
Any further conversation on the accredited versus registered, unaccredited versus registered discussion we're having? Not hearing any. Any continuing conversation on our Rule 4.240B? That was the synchronous, asynchronous conversation we're having prior to that. Any further dialogue on that point?
Oh, one question. I forget whose comment it was, but is there a concern that we need to better define the distinction between asynchronous and synchronous? I'm sorry, and whatever the other term is, I've forgotten that. Oh, it is synchronous and asynchronous, yeah.
I feel like we received comments in support, but this is such a change from what we have right now that if there's any question in your mind, I think it's an excellent idea to revisit.
Well, I thought somebody earlier was kind of hinting that the line was still a little fuzzy.
Is it possible to screen share Rule 4.240B as currently drafted so everyone can see the definition asynchronous and synchronous, if that's helpful?
That's a great idea. Just give us a moment.
Thank you.
Because that's certainly being clear about whatever we can is one of my crusades.
Dean Mesquet, do you want to speak before we screen share that?
No, you can go ahead and screen share. I just wanted to, if the asynchronous and synchronous definitions are satisfactory, then I will go back to, I think, a comment that Natalie made about the definitions of correspondence versus correspondence and distance learning law schools. I don't know if we need to keep that language, because it would appear that distance learning would have both asynchronous and synchronous, and correspondence, I guess, would only have an asynchronous association. So is the thought in not revising the actual terms, correspondence versus distance learning, the fact that we do need to keep both of those in the rules, or could it be that it's just distance learning or further defined by technological means of instruction primarily, or fixed facility or in-person learning, which is live bodies in interacting in fixed spaces.
I'm wondering what role distance has at all anymore, because it's about the whether it's in real time as opposed to just over time that the conversations are being held.
That's the
I could,
proposal right now. The schools would still have a duty of transparency, duty to be forthright. So to advise students whether that is in person, people, bodies standing in the same room, or over a distance, or what choices students would have. But yes, you're absolutely right as to this proposal.
and maybe I could just to Dean Amezcoa's point, just add some color that I think can help inform this. I think there's a connection between Paul's question about do these new terms, synchronous and asynchronous, get the job done? And then Dean Amezcoa, your question about why do these old definitions remain? I think in this initial draft, when we get to the synchronous and asynchronous language, we'll find that we defined it well, but we found ourselves still referring back to some of these old terms as examples because it's kind of just the regime we all know. I think, though, as we do this process together, we will get to a place where we likely can remove these from the definitions, and we will likely be at a place where the two new definitions can stand on their own without feeling tied to our existing language. So that existing language is there in the definitions because it is used later in the rules. But I think it's maybe the intent, I don't think necessarily was that the final draft would continue to use that, but it was as far as we had made it in developing these new definitions.
And Dean Marshall?
Yeah, I have I think my concern that's resonating is we use fixed, the term that keeps coming to my mind is face to face versus remote, not to add to the list of terms. And I feel better now that we've pulled this up, and I can see that we do at least address, because I think from a consumer protection perspective, synchronous and asynchronous capture a delivery modality, but it can be synchronous face to face, or it can be synchronous remote. But I see that we have that in the definition under fixed facility law school. So I think my concern is covered, although now that I'm reading these definitions again, there is still some ambiguity and confusion in terms of correspondence, distance learning, and fixed facility. I'm not sure those are all consistently distinguished correctly. I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's my comment.
No, and I would definitely agree with that comment, just from having multiple accreditors from WASC to the committee bar examiners. Is it distance education? Is it online education? Either of which, for online, could be synchronous or asynchronous. So I think that's why it's always helpful if we can, screen share these kind of definitions, because we might have a different definition in our head versus what was written here. As a further illustration to me, correspondence law school versus distance learning law school, those seem to be merging, since a correspondence law school can also be online as we go through that process. But I definitely like the asynchronous versus synchronous distinction. I think that's very helpful for the consumer to understand how do they learn better. Each of us has different learning modalities. Some need that interaction, others just need to be left alone with material, and that way they can choose which one is best for them. Any further discussion on our Rule 4.240B or our definitions now of synchronous, asynchronous, correspondence, law school, distance learning, or fixed facility law school?
Just for folks to know, what we plan to assemble for the committee is when there are a diversity of opinions. As we see here, the plan is to bring forth a diversity of opinions, not only in the minutes of CS bars, but through a report from the chair directly to the committee.
So hearing no further discussion, I think we can.
Can I add one more comment? I'm sorry.
Please, of course.
The well, now I lost my thought. I'm sorry. It'll probably come to me as we move on to the next spot. Sorry.
Oh, not a problem. And feel free to interject, and we can always jump back to that one. I think we do have time today for our remaining two areas. Could we, for our next one, that'll be my item, Rule 4.240C. Is it possible to put that on the screen? Could we scroll to that? 4.240C is in Charlie.
I'm sorry. It came back to me before we move on. Is there worth to throw into the bucket of terms hybrid, a combination of face-to-face and remote? Because I think that's becoming a real thing in terms of an alternative modality.
Again, great additional layer to the conversation now that we have many institutions that have multiple accreditations, or it could be distance, online, on-site, and now it's up to the student to select which one. Is that on a semester to semester? Is that on a course by course basis? How do we define what is hybrid? I would agree as well. Absolutely. So for my area, I was asked to look at and give my thoughts to Rule 4.240C. That's what we have on our screen. This is almost verbatim for the accredited school rules under 4.160D6, Delta 6, in comparison. And so those of us at the accredited schools will be more familiar with this, I believe. My thought in approaching this was, again, primarily to focus on the state bar's mission and protect the public on one aspect, public disclosures, but on the same aspect, also greater access and inclusion. I think the California bar and California's legal practice has been a great one because of the diversity of allowing people to qualify for the bar and bar membership, whether that's law office study, registered law schools, accredited law schools, ABA approved law schools. So I think those are the counter forces I was trying to think of as I was looking at this area. And first with the NPR, is this more of a requirement of disclosure where every registered and every accredited law school should disclose the same number? I think that one makes very good sense from a protect the public standpoint, a common measurement. You could look at every school versus should this be a requirement to operate for the registered schools? It's already a requirement to operate for the accredited schools. Should it be a requirement for the registered schools? I think that's a tougher one for me to think about as I was looking at it. The last layer, and at least in my thought in looking at this area, is the general bar exam the best consumer protection measurement for a registered school, or is rather the first year law students exam a better measurement? In that all of the registered schools are what for the credit schools we would call part-time. They're 4-year programs. So we're having a longer delay in the output of bar passage as a number compared to the education those students received. It's a much longer trail or tail on it versus with the first year law students exam, once someone has completed their first year and they've reached eligibility for their first year law students exam, much shorter tail on how that program is educating students in comparison to the first year law students exam. So those are the main areas I wanted us to think about. Is it possible to scroll down to the last part of section C? And if we could, I was saying that very last sentence, that didn't make sense to me, the very last sentence. In order to provide a sound program of legal education, seemed like just a tack on statement. I don't know if that's really necessary for a rule, So my recommendation would be to delete that last sentence of that paragraph on number 3, because I didn't see any benefit to that. So with that, my recommendation for conversation would be, is the requirement of the NPR, should that be solely a public disclosure recommendation, or should that be a requirement just to operate as a registered school? So I don't know if there's any dialogue just on that point.
So one thing I'll add to enrich the discussion is that effective with this reporting cycle, it will be a disclosure requirement for for unaccredited schools for the first time. So this proposal focuses on creating an enforceable standard. It would be helpful to get feedback on the idea of creating an enforceable standard. If there is such a standard, what would be a reasonable phase-in time? And some data that might be helpful to the group is to know that of the current group of unaccredited schools, all but 2 would meet this 40% minimum today, so they would already be in immediate compliance.
So
And one subtle aspect of this, Natalie, as I understand it, is that the formula for the unaccredited school pass rate is a little bit different right now than that is applied to accredited schools. Is that still correct?
Not effective with this year, so that's an important clarification.
Okay.
In the past, the accredited schools used this formula. The unaccredited schools looked at all takers over a calendar 5-year period. Effective this year, both unaccredited and accredited disclose this calculation. And then in addition, the most recent bar exam individual pass rates to provide something that is more current. There's a little bit of a lag in this measure to have time to calculate it. And also to address an issue raised by CS BAR's members that the consumer should understand whether there are long-term takers over more than 5 years. You'll see that coloring the individual pass rate number. So they are an apples to apples comparison now.
Okay. Yeah, so to set a background for all this, we've at various points at the Committee of Bar Examiners, we've touched on concerns about whether we draw the balance in favor of letting all students who want to take a shot at becoming a lawyer have that opportunity, so long as their odds are properly and clearly disclosed to them, versus protecting them from spending, in cases where they have virtually no chance of ever succeeding, from spending perhaps as much as $100,000 only to be in debt and with nothing to show for it. So that's, and some members, I don't know, it's probably fair to say they've been on both sides of it at various times. I'm sort of a waffler. I can see, the sort of libertarian aspect of just if they know what they're doing and they decide to roll the dice, fine. But it's going to come up again a little bit later when I make my comments. But where, so many people are rolling the dice and leaving all their money on the table, that is still somewhat concerning. So hopefully that'll help the rest of you address that. Yeah, and of course, phase in of this is important. That's an important question. But first, I suppose we have to get to the question of whether it should be a requirement at all. I am glad to see that we're at least making the disclosure formula uniform so that we can compare all law schools' performance, whether they're registered or accredited.
Dean Marshall?
Yeah, first let me agree with that last phrase in the paragraph. I don't see the need for it, it certainly should be implied with regard to the entire initiative before us. Secondly, I absolutely believe that it needs to be a disclosure, of course, for the consumer protection, particularly with respect to Mr. Kramer's last kind of dichotomy between the libertarian, who are we to direct somebody's lives and choices, as long as they have the information in front of them to make a sound decision. And then with regard to whether it should be a requirement for operation, one of the things that I've experienced here is nobody can predict, especially that pool of students who do not have high performance indicators going into the application process. The high LSAT, the high undergraduate privileged experience. Time and time again, the predictors at that lower level, low LSATs, the no LSATs, the student without the bachelor's degree, knock it out of the park. And because that is a consistent experience, I think, for all of us I would assume in the accredited and unaccredited realm, I think the libertarian view of let the consumer beware, but let the consumer choose so that they can maximize their potential to manifest to be all that others have told them they can't be. So I'm just kind of making that speech that I'm not sure it should be a standard for operation.
It might be helpful to make a clarification that this proposal, which is merely a proposal, is not meant to direct as to who can be or cannot be accepted, but rather to challenge the school to match the requirements, the feedback, the support to encourage those that they accept and those that they, in some sense, also take a chance on, have a reasonable opportunity to go forward, understanding that these students will invest anywhere from $8,000 to $100,000 to do so. So it's putting responsibility on both sides, but not necessarily saying do or do not accept any students that you haven't previously.
Dean Mesqua?
Yeah, just one point is I do think that for registered schools, I do think we're minimizing the impact of the first year law students exam on the kind of the success factors. I certainly don't have the breadth of knowledge in terms of seeing years and years of first year law students passers end up being successful. So I think the other registered deans would have better input. However, that may we probably need to make some better correlations with the fact that almost all of the registered schools are meeting this 5-year already meeting this 5-year requirement because of the baby bar threshold that the students have to pass in order to get through. So this idea that without this, we're increasing the number of students that would waste dollars over 4 years is not necessarily the case. There is still the data. There is data to say that there is a correlative aspect of being able and better prepared to continue your education, to be successful, and to pass the bar. But I would in the few baby first year law students exam passers that we've seen are the best students, and they come from even from the accredited at the accredited schools, those baby bar takers come from no college background or no college background, because that's a requirement of the accredited schools. So I don't know that there's a direct correlation with having the baby bar and then having students essentially waste 4 years, because many students don't get to year 2 because of the baby bar threshold.
And Dean Hunt?
Well, Dina Mesquith stole my argument for the most part, but it shows you great minds think alike. Really tying into the consumer protection aspect, I think the 40% disclosure is reasonable. I don't object to making it a requirement either. But as far as protecting students financially, I guess I would like to draw attention to the first year law students exam, and that students are permitted to continue their legal education even after not passing it on their first opportunity. And in numerous cases, that can allow students to get well into their third year of law school before they are cut off from continuing to pay tuition based on their inability to pass the first year law students exam. At the California School of Law, and I can only speak for our program, if the student doesn't pass the first year law students examination on their first opportunity to take it, they do not continue in their legal education. We don't put them into con law and real property and keep collecting tuition. And one thing that we could do here as a consumer protection method would be to implement something along those lines, so that students are not permitted to keep paying tuition if they can't pass the first year law students exam, and getting 3/4 of the way through law school or more before they're finally cut off. We have always done it that way, and I think since we're discussing it, it's something to consider.
Ms. Leonard?
Thanks, Dean Frickberg, and thanks, Dean Hunt. For purposes of just historical context, historically, there was a time when all students were required to take and pass the exam on the first opportunity or be dismissed from law school. And then at a certain point, there was concern and pushback for those that, for example, might not be available. Imagine someone having a baby during the same time as the exam, or some other sort of example. And so then the 3 opportunities was created as an allowance, and the opportunity to continue was created as an allowance, but not a requirement. And schools can make their own policies. There are some schools like California School of Law that do not allow a student to continue. But we do understand that there could be market pressure when some allow and some do not in that circumstance. That doesn't mean that this couldn't change, but just so you know, it was the way that Dean Hunt was describing in the past. It is this way now for some of that reason. And looking ahead, we welcome your feedback as to whether to return to where it had been, stay how it is, or come up with a new rubric that's appropriate for the future. And in particular, this is a statutory requirement with respect to the first year. So any change in this regard would be at the pleasure of the legislature. As far as the first year law students exam specifically.
With that dialogue, do we have a consensus potentially to make a recommendation for or against, as the committee for the CS bars to the CBE, for adoption of 4.240B as an enforceable standard? Any discussion on that? Do we have a consensus within our committee? I will take your silence as we do not have a consensus. Second part, again, in this area, I think we had a good, robust conversation on the NPR. Is potentially the recommendation for a similar comparison one instead of NPR as a first-year pass rate. Again, just to make it as a recommendation, if we want to have a discussion on that, should there be a first-year pass rate? Again, if we're truly looking at consumer protection, public disclosure, that would give the shortest tail of time between an output measurement passage on the first-year law student's exam versus legal education at a registered school, which would only be a year to a year and a half old in comparison. Any discussion on that as a first-year pass rate? Dean Amesqua?
I would be I think I would support that if there was similar data that's been mentioned already to to what looking at presenting data that says over 2 years the pass rates for schools in general are this and this. I mean, the general pass rate for the first year law students exam in general is fairly low. We have recently changed the structure of the exam, and so even the committee said that they needed at least several years before they could review whether to change it further. And so if if there was a minimum standard for the first year law students exam, we could rely on some past numbers to try and create a proposal for what the standard might be. But I think so I would support it if there's an effort made to present some research on, to start the conversation on what a threshold could and should be. It definitely should not be below what the common standard rate is, and should definitely be a more a higher and aspiring number. But I'm sure we have that data in order to present that research. But hopefully I'm making sense. But that would be my concern with just with as a part of this process. I just identifying some type of threshold, but I would be more in favor of that with the research rather than the immediate imposition of the 5-year NPR. But that's just my thought.
Dina Mesqua, may I ask a clarifying question so that I can capture this appropriately? I think what I heard you advocating was that you'd be open to considering a required minimum, but before doing so, you would be interested in data that correlates for bar exam pass rates with those that have passed the first year?
No, just maybe some data that shows the individual school pass rates so that we could come to a common number. So, for example, I don't know the history of how we got to 40% for the 5-year and 5 years for the NPR, but I assume for accredited standard, but I would assume there was a lot of data, incorporated into that. And so I'm just making sure we do a similar due diligence before we just assign a standard number that registered schools would need to meet on the first year law students exam without an equivalent due diligence. The other thing that could also impact that is we do have just in the last 5 years or last year 2 years a significant number of registered schools that have closed. So it might be better to do that study based on the data of the schools that are still there, and you might actually get a better aspirational number from that without including the 20 schools that existed, registered schools that existed 20 years ago or 10 years ago versus the 8 that are currently there. But that's the yes, to clarify, it's the data and research on the first year law school first year law students exam passage rates themselves, not necessarily the correlation. I mean, the correlation data has been done, and it's not 100%, but it is a significant enough number to be correlative of bar success. That's been established. So I think the if we're assigning a number to a percentage of pass rate to the first year law students exam, then we need more data.
Thanks. I appreciate that clarification. It helps me to capture your feedback.
And committee member Kramer, you had your hand up earlier. I don't know if you still had a question or point.
No, I think he covered it.
Thank you. Any other further dialogue on the potential of a first year pass rate companion to the MPR for the first year law students exam? From what I've heard, it sounds like the consensus, at least from the head movements I saw, it might be too early to create that number, as the June 24 and October 24 had a different testing style of multiple choice online, and we need to wait for feedback on that data more long term, as well as the change to the number of schools that encompass the registered schools. So if we're taking data from earlier, it might be misleading compared to the current sample set of registered schools. Dean Marshall?
More of a question, so forgive my ignorance, but are registered schools required to disclose their first year bar exam?
They do
pass rates?
on their internal disclosure, but actually not on the web disclosure. And that's been a thought about something to consider for the future.
Thank you.
So the students don't see it then?
They see it
Prospective
in
students?
their disclosures that are associated with their enrollment agreement, or depending on the size of the school, they can see it in, actually, no, they see the bar statistics. So they see it with their enrollment agreement.
Is there any reason not to have that available on the web, so that people who are shopping, because if you're shopping schools and you only see that after your decision has gotten a lot of inertia, I don't think it's as effective as an informative device than if you see it when you're starting out your comparisons.
That's definitely something that we can look into, and we can share with you a copy of the enrollment disclosure as well as the web disclosure.
Last opportunity if there's any discussion on the MPR or potential first year pass rate before we move on to our fifth and final discussion for rule revisions for unaccredited law schools. Hearing none, I will now turn over to our committee member Kramer.
Okay, we've started to talk about first year law student standard. So I think we've covered that. The other thing that has raised some concern at the committee level is attrition, first year attrition. We've run into a school, or at least one recently, and I might actually be a little bit traumatized by hearing this, and I may not be the only committee member, to learn that there's a school or two perhaps where 90% of their initial or their entering first year students don't make it out at the end of the first year. And that's kind of striking. So we're wondering about ways to address that. Natalie, is that a part of disclosures at this point?
Yes.
Okay, so at least potential candidates know what a school's doing, how they're doing in that regard. But some members of the committee are wondering what could be done to make the schools a little bit better. I think it was Dean Marshall was suggesting that that's just a very difficult task to figure out who is going to blossom among the candidates. But I'm wondering if one of the tools that we've talked about is an entrance, using mandatory use of an entrance exam as part of the criteria. And there's what's the name of that the new program, Natalie? That's much lower cost than say the LSAT.
Well, in addition to the LSAT and the GRE, there's also the JD Next, which is slightly different and wrapped into the cost, which is currently $199, is essentially a prep program.
And what would an LSAT cost someone?
I'd have to check to see the current figure. And also recall that there has been a recent change to the LSAT. The logic games were removed from that. And so we're seeing an overall surge in the registrations for the LSAT. Not that the State Bar is the administrator of that program. We are not.
But it's become less daunting to candidates, it sounds like.
I can't tell you their reasoning. I can just tell you what the registrations are at.
Although it's not encouraging to know that logic is no longer perhaps a part of the equation, but whatever. Anyway, so I'm putting that out there as something that the committee may be interested in trying to address in some way, whether it's entrance exams, making some kind of either mandatory or at least a kind of rule of thumb standard that if the attrition rate is above some particular rate, that there's going to be an intensive intervention, on our behalf with the school to reduce it to what we consider to be a reasonable level. And what should that reasonable level be?
May I bring in another piece of feedback that we received from the Council on Access and Fairness?
Sure.
They definitely carefully think about exams, about the purpose of exams, the performance of exams. At one point that they raised was that at this time, not only unaccredited, but also accredited and ABA schools are increasingly offer not only fixed facility, but also online programs. And so their concern is that while they previously had some reservations about exams, they feel more supportive in requiring that now because previously students that needed an online program were limited in the categories, but now having that figure, which would be required at ABA schools, can help them understand which of these three categories are options for me, so that I may ultimately select the right one from all the choices available to me. So that's a little feedback from the Council on Access and Fairness.
So opening up's maybe another choice that they wouldn't have ever otherwise considered.
Potentially.
Or, yeah, okay. So that's guess I'm tossing that out for discussion. We don't have any particular language yet, but I hope that the general concepts are clear enough that we can get your feedback about that.
Dean Marshall?
Yeah, and Mr. Kramer, I believe this is a great conversation and it's going to require multiple ones because it triggers so many thoughts. So let me just address the ones that are at the top for me immediately. Attrition, given the experience that I've lived through, is a metric that, on the one hand, demonstrates the school's responsible in doing their job, especially with respect to the standard to determine as soon as possible whether somebody has the capacity to be successful and not to prey on that student for 3 years. So I wouldn't want us or the committee to do anything that would de-incentivize that zealous assessment of the student that should take place during all 3 years, but in particular, that first semester. So that we are protecting them. We give them the choice, but then we're not going to allow them to harm themselves and or prey on them if it was the wrong choice after a year of expenditure. I don't think we should be concerned about a robust attrition rate. Now, 90% is not robust. I agree with you. I don't know what's going on there. So from that perspective, my first reaction is, we'll put a cap, that a school that has attrition over, 40, 50%, jeopardizes, would indicate that there's something wrong with their admissions process. So that intervention piece comes in and says that this is evidence that you don't have a robust admissions process. And then I would leave with this note, even though I think there's just a lot to be said about it. Entrance tests, again, there's so much data at the accredited level, certainly at the level that I've experienced, that the entrance tests, like the LSAT scores at the low range, are not reliable predictors of a student's ability to succeed in law school. They are reliable at the higher levels, but at the lower level, not so much. And I've witnessed there's a lot of adults, working adults, who won't go to law school because they don't have the time to sit and study for an LSAT. And so they have 15 to 20 years of experience in law enforcement or in some field that demonstrates that they certainly have the capacity to succeed at something. And because they didn't take an admissions test, an LSAT that would otherwise disqualify them, they got into a law school and they passed the bar the first time. So I really get concerned about regulating a school of how they should vet a student for admissions. Some interview, some use the LSAT, some use the GRE, some use a boot camp. But I think you can have a standard on admissions, and that at some point that attrition gets to a level that would indicate you don't have a meaningful admissions process. So I would throw that out just to begin the conversation.
And Dean Hunt?
To the 2 points, as far as the attrition goes, really relating to our last subject, if the law school's first-year law student exam pass rate is substantially high, then it shows they are doing a good job weeding out the students early in the process before too much tuition is charged, and protecting the consumers from themselves who cannot do it. And so I certainly can see how those two things could be tied together over the long run if we were to set a first-year law students exam pass rate requirement, that then you could say, well, we live with the attrition because the first-year law students exam there is there as a protection. And then regarding the LSAT or GRE, I know this is a conversation that I had with Natalie, I think 2 weeks ago. I sort of see it as all or nothing. I don't think there's an in-between or a suggestion. Either all of the accrediteds and all of the unaccrediteds require it. Otherwise, it's very difficult to say, hey, certain schools are doing it. Then there's going to be a feeling within the schools that are implementing the LSAT as a requirement, that the other schools that don't have it are going to get more students. And so I've always been comfortable with it if it were a requirement, but it would have to be across the board. You can't just ask schools to do it, because you're asking them to make a sacrifice that probably most are not going to make.
Let me ask you though, if a school attrits, say, 60–70% of their first year students, they never get the opportunity to take the first year exam. So it seems to me that affects your faith in the first year exam as proving that their attrition isn't a problem, because so many failed out without being able, having that test be the mechanism.
But then you're saying that the only way unaccredited should determine who isn't allowed to go to the second year is the first year law students exam. And I think our professors do an excellent job very early on of saying these students aren't prepared and aren't qualified, and we're not going to continue taking their tuition.
Yeah. But I guess what underlies your opinion then is you're not concerned that somebody might be wasting several $1,000s to $25,000. Who's been admitted, who obviously has no chance from the start.
Well, every school, I think, has their own mechanisms for determining who should and shouldn't be admitted to the program. We use an introductory course that students don't receive credit for in order to try and eliminate students before they're enrolled. And then from there, we say, well, these students have a decent shot. And then, of course, there's substantial attrition at the end of the first semester and second. And then as we move through the program, we get down to the group that we feel is qualified for the first year law students exam. And we try not to use the first year law students exam as our determining factor of who is capable and not. We try and do it during the first year.
Okay. Thanks.
And Dean Hiroshek?
Attrition is always a concern. I think I know for me, and I know for all of the deans, for multiple reasons. One, that consumer protection, right? We do not want to take the money from individuals who do not have that reasonable possibility of completing the program. I believe that's the language in the rules. And even if that wasn't the language in the rules, that's what we would stand for. That's what I would stand for. And my concern about this discussion is oftentimes the reason students don't make it through their first year is not academics. I can't speak for Unaccredited, but I think that they have the same types of individuals. Our students are working full-time, attending law school, have children, or are they sandwich generation where they're also taking care of their parents, etc. And they are juggling a lot of things and cannot take time off to study for a final exam or a midterm. And so no matter how many academic interventions that a law school includes, we have added a lot of full-time academic support. And yet we still see attrition. I talk to the students who have gotten a D or whatever on a midterm, and we have that discussion. What's happening? Is it, and a lot of the times it's financial, it's personal, it's not academics. And so I would just asks us that whenever we're talking about attrition, that we look beyond just the numbers and look at what's happening, what's the rationale. We ask our students if they're withdrawing, why. Oftentimes they put personal, and then I try to figure out, is there something that we can help, etc. But anyway, that's really attrition is a big concern.
Dean Amesqua?
And there must be some people who, can I follow up with her?
Please.
So there must be some people who just decide that the law isn't for them, right?
Exactly. That balance between giving people an opportunity and still not taking their money for any period of time that they couldn't or wouldn't be able to complete. So they take a class and they say, ooh, I thought law school was going to be this. I saw it on TV, or I saw all these wonderful, television shows about lawyers, Suits and all of those, right? It was Perry Mason for me. And it's not for them. And so it's gone. So back to what's the rationale, not just the numbers.
Thanks.
And Dean Amesqua?
So I would agree with all the points that folks have made. I also think that this idea of attrition also not only does it not take into account, but it's not always taking into account the types of students. And I don't think financial is also a big reason for attrition. To a certain extent, we are less, our schools are less expensive in general than.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So I don't think it takes into account, it definitely doesn't take into account all of the factors that contribute to attrition. But, I also think it should be pointed out that there is some comprehensiveness to the academic standard requirements for schools. So just for an example, at Lincoln, if we have, the state bar requires us to set a standard for graduation. There is an average GPA standard at all of our schools for graduation. If someone doesn't meet that standard, then they're subject to, withdrawal or expulsion. If they don't meet the amount of classes that they 80% of the classes that they can attend, they're subject to expulsion or withdrawal. So I do think that there are, and at Lincoln, for example, you can pass your first year classes, but they would be below the GPA requirement for your first year that you need to maintain. And but if you pass so you would be subject to disqualification. But by the state bar standards, you would still be eligible to take the first year law students exam, and the clock starts ticking on your three exam timeline. So I think that there are many other things, including the academic standard that we try to uphold. But even in the rules that we have to follow, we can still certify someone that may be subject to disqualification after their first year, because they barely passed their classes, but they didn't meet our minimum GPA requirements for a first year. And I'm aware that there are certain standards like that at other schools, especially on a first year law students requirement track. So I also think that 70% attrition is actually, because of the first year law students exam, is the standard. The pass rate at certain schools and in some recent exams is 30%. So that means that you could potentially be losing up to 70% of your first year students. And 90% or at one or two schools is not necessarily a justification or a trend. I would say it's an anomaly, and I would hope that you're working directly with those schools, but not using it as a guideline for all of the registered schools for sure. And so those would be my comments on that.
Dean Marshall?
Yeah, I just want to pile on a little bit here about what we are seeing more and more systemically is it's not an academic attrition as much as they had no idea that law school was going to take this amount of energy and commitment and focus. They may have had an undergraduate experience with a GPA of a 3.8, and I don't know if there's grade inflation going out there, but then they come to law school. And it's a whole other experience, as we all know, because we went to law school. And so for that working adult, they just did not factor in the compartmentalized dimensions to their lives: work, family, law school, study. And a lot of that attrition is due to a fact that the person miscalibrated their own life, not their academic performance. And that's highlighted by the fact that we have seen several students, oh my God, I had no idea law school is this hard, on the verge of disqualifying themselves, withdraw, and then apply to start over and be top of their class because they got it right the second time, but they got so far behind. So I really want the committee to understand that students that are coming into law school have no idea haven't experienced the rigor that it takes to become that professional until they do. So.
And just to echo some of the points I heard in my own slight variation on it, I would only be concerned if I was looking at a school, looking at a program, if I saw the academic attrition after the first year exceeded the academic attrition of the first year. As many of the CalBARs and the registered schools are opportunity mission schools, we're trying to bring people in to the fold that might have the intellectual capacity, but they don't have the emotional wherewithal, financial wherewithal, or they just decide it's just not worth it. And so I think the focus should be on academic, not just attrition. Separately, also, I think numbers can be misleading. So instead of looking at percentages, I went to see what is the actual end value. Because many of these schools are very small, and you can have a large percentage shift. If you only have 20 students, each student is 5 percentage points. And so that's something also I would, recommend consideration given to. And if there is a school with what we believe is an abnormally high attrition rate, academic, how are they doing on the first year law students exam? How are they doing on their time to completion? How are they doing on their bar passage? Because maybe they're fulfilling their opportunity mission, giving people a chance and a fair chance, and then dismissing them, but still performing their mission of maybe a 40% MPR, as we've discussed today. So I think it's anytime we look at only one specific criterion, that's dangerous. I think we always have to look at the whole institution itself. Any further discourse or conversation on this topic of attrition?
Well, thank you all for those comments. What I'm hearing is that this is a complicated issue, so a holistic examination of the circumstances of a school who on the face of it appears to be attriting a lot of students is the appropriate way to measure if there really is a problem or not. Is that fair?
Fair by me.
All right. Thanks again.
Committee Member Kramer, are there any other areas you wanted to discuss with our committee today?
I think that's all we've been talking about, right, Natalie? She's still here?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm muted. I believe that's all that you have placed on the list, unless there are any others or that you wanted to share today.
No, I think I'm good.
That completes our agenda for today. Are there any points any committee members would like to revisit from our conversation today before we adjourn? Not hearing any, we will now stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.